Morning all. The London Classic is upon us. Yesterday was a very exciting set of games which I'd like to check out. Let's start with Levon Aronian against Hikaru Nakamura. So Levon currently ranked 2 in the world, playing white, and Nakamura's up there of course, but had a bit of a turbulent year in some tournaments. But one of his comments, perhaps very wisely, is about chess players' class, not losing a chess player's class, even if you might lose 1 or 2 games. The fundamental class is there. So let's see his play in this game with black against the number 2 in the world. So the English opening, and we have symmetrical English. So knight f3, knight c6. Okay. And now an early d4, which you might think is a fairly logical move. Creates more pressure on d5 frontally. Positionally, it's the d5 square which the player with the English opening is often focusing on. So it seems a fairly logical move without too much of a downside. Let's see what happened. After c takes d4, knight takes d4. The move knight f6 doesn't actually hit a pawn or anything. Looks like usually black will continue this sort of position with maybe a hedgehog type move. Maybe there's a problem with d6 sometimes, but e6 you might think could be plausible for a hedgehog. But we see actually after g3 a very violent forcing move. Violent in that white's whole strategy is designed usually against the d5 square. So this next move seems a little bit surprising, and maybe a product of technical preparation. In fact, the move e5. You might think, well, it's not just the d5 square which is a problem here, it's d6. Surely d6 is a little bit of a problem as well. So this next move by white seemed logical enough. Knight b5, eyeing that d6. And if black plays something like d6, then perhaps white has a very nice game with bishop g2. The knight can come back. Maybe a loss of time is compensated by an iron grip on the d5 square, or even maybe using this knight and bringing this knight back like this if a6. But we see in this position bishop b4 check, forcing move here, bishop d2, and now a6. In some lines of Sicilian, this is kind of encouraged. It looks a little bit like a very sharp variation which might occur in a Sicilian. Okay, so a6. Well, at the moment, knight d6 is now ruled out. There's nothing protecting d6 because of that bishop b4. So what about bishop takes b4 here? Well, actually, white in this position thought it was best to just retreat the knight. We'll check out alternatives here. It's a very sharp position in the second pass of this game. So knight just retreated. So can white maintain an iron grip on d5? It looks logical enough to play like this, but it's black's opportunity has caused disruption on that d file, on that frontal pressure, and black uses this opportunity here to strike out with d5, freeing his game quite significantly. Freeing his game, it seems, on the surface. After c takes d5, knight takes d5. No backward pawn on the d file. After bishop g2, bishop e6. It seems now, after castles, white's position is a bit passive, a bit of a wet lettuce position, as I'd say, with the English opening. When I was on the verge of giving up the English opening totally, this sort of position looks a little bit on the passive side. It doesn't seem so convincing, white's domination of d5 at all now. Black's kind of broken that bind. Bishop e3 is played, which positively invites knight c4, which is played to try and get the dark square bishop, which you might think is an asset. If black can get the dark square bishop, then this bishop is going to be more dangerous, surely, on the dark squares. And then all the dark squares, especially on the king side like f2, could be a problem later. But white's idea, I believe, with this next move, queen c1, well, he has to protect b2 as well. So he doesn't mind giving that up. If he can get control back of d5, there'll be a big upside to all this. After castles, which implies that there's no interest just yet in taking that bishop. Rook d1, queen c7. Okay, in this position, you might think a forcing move like knight d5 might be interesting to consider. But we'll check that out in the second pass. Here, Levon decided to play a3. And now we see knight takes e3, queen takes e3. And after bishop a5, the bishop seems to be having a good time. There's no counterpart here. There's no dark square bishop for white. So what is going on here? The trade-offs in the position. Black's dark square control. Black's got a kind of lead in development. This knight's still at base. The rooks are not connected. These rooks are connected. Black's use of the d file is going to be faster, surely, and the use of d4. But the dark squares in particular, surely, are among the chief trump cards that black has here. This dark square strategy and the dark square bishop. We see after knight d2, okay, if white's given time, white can also try, potentially, as well as the d5 square, to use the c5 square and maybe try and neutralize this bishop if he can get something on c5 going. So bishop b6, and we see queen f3 here, which, okay, if knight d4, then maybe queen takes b7, so this battery is useful for tying down the knight, it would seem. Rook a d8, also preventing knight d5 from white. Rook a d8. And now knight a4, and maybe the idea here is to just shut down this bishop with the c5 square potentially. Bishop a7, queen c3, so eyeing both c5 and e5. Okay, and maybe, just maybe, white could, in some circumstances, consider taking on c6, just to dent black's pawn structure. With if b takes is not played, if queen takes, then queen e5. So this next move shields the e5 pawn and attacks the knight, a forcing move. White's response is to protect the knight here with queen c2, and then we see f5. Very aggressive play. The rook's naturally being activated. White looks to have a passive position except for that c5 square. So e3, rook dd8, and now b4 marking out the c5 square, which seems to be white's principal asset. Now we see the move e4, which not only shuts down the bishop but gives black potentially this knight e5 once this knight is unpinned. And this knight is about to be unpinned in great style now after knight b3 with the move queen f7. This is really good looking forcing move here. Battery on that knight. Knight bc5, and the bishop doesn't mind playing to d5 here. Black really has a threat now. These knights are a bit wobbly to b6 here. If this knight moves, then bishop b3 again. There's things on the skewer here. This queen, this knight, and this rook knight and queen's being skewered with bishop b3. In fact, what can white do here about that? Bishop d5 also had the virtue of, well, not that knight a6 was a threat because of bishop b3. It looks like a precarious position, really. A fragile construction here. White's next move is to play rook d2 and just wait for b6, it seems. b6 is played, testing white. And now we get, well, it looks virtually forced, because if knight takes a6, then there's bishop b3, just seemingly winning a piece. But we'll check this out in the second pass. It looks clear enough, really. So this exchange sack seems absolutely forced for a pawn here. At least there's no bishop b3s. But now, okay, knight e5. There's some other menacing threats on the horizon here. For example, knight f3 could be dangerous at some point. Just doubling rooks could be dangerous for rook d2. Also, maybe even queen b7 is potentially dangerous, but we'll check the main threats in the second pass here. After rook d1, which was played, rook fd8, exchange of rooks. Queen takes d5 though. So you might think, well, why actually do that? He could be approaching time pressure as well. Now it just seems white's compensation for being exchanged down is nebulous, with queen d1 on the horizon, and a potential knight f3 looks too dangerous. It looks mega dangerous. So knight b2 protects d1 at least. Queen d2, not minding the exchange of queens here. Queen c7 is played, which, okay, it double attacks, but there's a very powerful move for black here. I wonder if you can spot it. If I give you 10 seconds starting from now. Okay, knight g4. Just on f2, it looks absolutely crunching this position. I don't think I haven't seen Levon destroyed like this. He resigned here. I don't think I've seen him destroyed like this for quite a while with the white pieces. His English was obliterated. The impression I get is, it just emphasises chess is such a gigantic game that even the second best player in the world can be destroyed on a bad day. Maybe he was tired on the travel. It is the first round. Players have to travel to London. The circumstances around the game, tiredness must factor in, preparation must factor in. So maybe they could really prepared for this line. So much for the d5 control that the English player might expect. But let's review the game and flip the board now in with some technical analysis. So in this position, just to see how bad the position is, or otherwise. Okay, if knight, well, okay, we're talking +6. So engine's giving knight d3 or knight d1. Let's go with this. Back to d2. Trying to defend like this. It's just a piece down, isn't he? It's hopeless. So if let's do the obvious then. Of taking the bishop, white will just get mated with queen f2, mate f3, queen e1. Yes, it's as simple as that, really. It's as simple as that. The issues are too much. After knight g4, f2 is just a disaster. Even without the absence of, well, this bishop hemmed in doesn't matter. Let's go back and see what is going on here. There's an anti-English opening system. There's early d4, which might seem very tempting to a lot of players, a lot of club players, may be horrified by this game now to see this. Why was this such a disaster? So CD knight takes d4, knight f6. It's reminiscent of a Sicilian type position, but with pawn on c4. So g3. e5 is mentioned here, technically. Who would have thought? Also queen b6 is another sharp move. e5 is mentioned. So e5 is played. And we saw knight b5. And this is so black's banner already. This is ridiculous. Really? But the engine is implying d6. So is this some sort of innovation? Let's have a look. I'm going to leave this on some depth to see the idea of bishop b4 check here. Is this really a major innovation? instead of a6 or d6 to play bishop b4 check in this position. It looks like a very surprising move. I presume it's been played before. I'll leave some notes in the video description. If I'll do some opening research actually on this position, or maybe you guys might want to just leave some comments in the description to see about bishop b4 check being played before in this position. It seems, well, it turns out remarkably well. Bishop b4 check. So bishop d2 was played. Was it better to play knight 1 to c3 here? It does keep control of d5. If a6 now, then surely, okay, well, knight d6 is now possible. That's one point. Might be fine here, surely. White's control of d5 is okay, etc. So maybe, I don't know. This doesn't congest the d file. It's easy to suggest in retrospect. Knight 1 to c3, and if d6 here, then a3. Just get the maybe even better than knight takes is just b takes. Okay, so this seems interesting. Why? Okay, why did white play bishop d3 and not knight 1 to c3? That's one question to ask here. We're still in some sort of book. So bishop d2, but it does seem okay. The move a6 just seems to justify bishop b4 because of this disruption for knight d6 not being available now, or not as effective. So a6. So the question about the knight retreated. What about bishop takes b4? So a takes b5, and then bishop has to move. Bishop d6. So it becomes a pawn sack. B takes c4, knight c3. But what about the king? It's stranded in the centre. Knight c3 also prevents knight e4 to wrench out the bishop. Okay, in this position, queen a5, superficially at depth 16, queen a5. Can this bishop actually be wrenched out of this position? Rook a6? Is it to try and get an attack on this bishop? Is this really part of the preparation, maybe, of this line? If takes here, let's go with d takes, d2. It's a sharp position to play for black. h6 just preventing maybe g5 use. Knight d5. If white ever takes that pawn, then castles, and black should be okay. It's interesting anyway. So as a pawn sacrifice, instead we saw knight 5 to c3. Now this liberating d5. I don't know. It looks as though black had solved most of the opening problems to equalise here. The engine likes black as well, quite a bit actually, approaching half a pawn. So it looks visually as though there's some problems for white, especially on these light squares. Actually, as soon as a3 is played, another light square being weakened. So knight b6 is looking nasty for knight c4 as a resource. Bishop e3 is giving us one of the better moves. Knight c4. Queen c1 just looks passive. Queen c1. I just wonder if this is tiredness now. Is there no more active moves for white than queen c1, or is it virtually forced? Where is this bishop? This bishop is kind of locked out of the game in this position. It's a real problem. Where does it go? White doesn't really want to allow the wretched double pawn, surely, with a move like this. sharp line here. I don't know, it seems okay, maybe that's better than the game for white. There's some opportunities here, a backward pawn. Okay, it seems better than the game, that continuation, but in the game, yeah, it just seems miserable, this Queen C1 here. What happened? Queen C7, so we saw A3. Natural looking moves. Knight takes E3 and the bishop coming back with tempo on that diagonal. Now, was this an opportunity for Knight D5 here? Just to try and pounce on that D5 square in this position. And if Knight D4, it looks dangerous for Knight C2. But maybe not so, just not a problem. If Knight's C2 here, just Rook C1. Rook FD8. Still, okay, I mean, this looks okay for white, except for this monster knight on D4. So yeah, I think, okay, maybe Knight D5 was a little bit better than the game. Knight D2, so we saw Bishop B6, Queen F3. He's tying down the knight. That is really the case, isn't it? Queen takes B7 is the case, yes. So Rook AD8, and we saw now Knight A4, which, given the circumstances, looks like one of the best ideas. And now Queen C3 again, given the circumstances, it's to use that C5 square. Okay, what was the threat here? Just out of interest, what is the actual threat? If white's given another move, then maybe the threat is Bishop takes C6. It's mentioned, and Knight E4, Knight E4 and Bishop C6. Knight E4, Knight EC5 if given another move. Okay, so Rook D4. Okay, on the knight, Queen C2, and now we see F5, which actually the engine likes F5 in this position. It's not so much about trying to smash white's kingside up with F4. It does provide E4, which gives the knight E5, but also this F7 square is particularly nifty for B3 use. So we see E3. Okay, is E3, well, otherwise what is white doing here? It's a difficult position. It can't do any operation with the knight just like that. And what if he played, you might ask, Knight C5, what would be the threat? Bishop takes C5, Queen takes Rook FD8, and this looks nasty now on D2. If the Queen stumbles back, Queen D6, just massive gigantic pin on the D file. That's much better. What's white doing there? He's actually losing a piece by force there. So, bit of a problem to play Knight C5 in this position because of that D file. So E3 was played. Okay. No doubling on the D file or trebling on the D file just yet. So B4 looks logical enough to play B4. E4. E4 or Queen F7, either are good moves here apparently from a technical point of view. So Knight B3, Queen F7 on that knight, goes to C5. Now let's move Bishop D5. It's played. And white's knights look fragile to B6 here. Could white have played Knight C3? Was this actually a little bit of a blunder? Knight C3. Evaluation has now gone down. Takes. Rook takes. Here. An exchange sack here. No, it's not an exchange sack, pardon me. This position looks as though it should be okay for white, so I wonder, is this a blunder point after Bishop D5 just not play knight c3. Doesn't look as devastating as the game continuation. Knight c3. Bishop b3 can't be played to the knight. So if bishop takes c5, we play rook takes d5 here. Actually, rook takes d5 is the most accurate. If knight takes d5, bishop d4. It's not nice for white. So with rook takes d5, it's a little bit more forcing. So rook takes d5, let's look at this again. So knight takes d5, queen takes. Yes, this looks miles better than the game, even though it's not that ambitious, but it's miles better than the game. In the game, we saw rook d2, which may be a major blunder. Just the b6. The exchange sack idea here didn't seem that convincing. Okay, b6 looks in principle like an ugly looking move, blocking in the bishop, but there are a lot of concrete threats revolving around b6, like bishop b3 here. So this exchange sack virtually forced. What else is there? If knight takes a6, bishop b3. And the point here actually is not about winning the knight, it's about this d2 rook. If queen takes c6, rook takes d2. And then later queen e8 is going to be nasty, potentially. The black's actual move, rook c2 or queen c4, as it's threatened. Alright, so things have gone wrong here, pear-shaped for white. Exchange sack. Now knight e5, getting knight out of the firing line. And what is actually black threatening here? Let's have a look. If we press the X, black is simply threatening in one idea is just to double the rooks. Another idea is queen d7, putting more pressure on the d file and the knight. Okay, so white played rook d1 to just parry that d file. So rook f d8. There's no choice now. Otherwise rook d2, so taking, giving black the d file. Then we see knight b2 is just gone to rubble white's position after queen d2. It's just been destroyed. This is just awful exchange down. If white did take knight a4, rook a2, these knights are not good on the a file. It's pretty miserable. a3 is going to drop. So okay, in the game it was just an immediate loss here, and end of game, knight g4. It just shows how gigantic chess is, all the possibilities that even the best in the world can be absolutely destroyed with the white pieces. It's amazing. But you know, credit to Nakamura. If a lot of this must have been preparation. And it's a very sharp idea to invite a bishop to d6 in the opening. Okay, so well, many thanks to both players for such a very interesting, dynamic encounter. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks so much.